get a video going here in a second, okay?
That sounds great, and I'll keep an eye on the chat. If it looks like you've tried something you want us to try to trigger the video again, just pop something in the chat, and I'll click on that and see if it works. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. You're joining the 2020 Virtual FOI Summit, and like everything in this COVID virtual era, we are experiencing some technical difficulties, but we'll soldier through. So thank you for joining us. The FOI Summit, the 31st Annual FOI Summit is presented by the National Freedom of Information Coalition, and we thank you for your participation. My name is Diego Ibargüen. I serve as counsel in the Hearst Corporation Office of General Counsel based out of New York. I'll be your moderator today for this session, which is titled Achieving Police Transparency Reform. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. I think it'll be really interesting. I'll just talk briefly about myself. I'm an in-house litigator. I've been with Hearst for about 8 years. Before that, I worked at a New York law firm with a particular focus on First Amendment issues. My role at Hearst is largely, it's a general litigation role, but I generally work with all of our newspapers, television stations, and magazines. And a big part of my work involves access to government and court records. So this is a subject matter that is near and dear to my heart. Before going to law school, I worked as a reporter. So I come at these issues with a little bit of both sides of at least two of the sides. One, the desire to get access and inform the public. The other, to fight for the legal interests at stake. I want to set the scene a little bit just at the outset. Given this topic, I mean, policing is a complicated issue. It is a kind of a compact that we've all established in our communities, where we empower a group of people to act in our name. We arm them. We send them into situations that by design are dangerous. And we have appropriately high expectations that they're going to act appropriately when they go out and carry out the business of the police in our name as the people. Like all public officials, we want to be able to hold them accountable when they don't act appropriately. But holding police accountable is exceptionally hard if we don't have transparency into what they're doing and how they're doing it. So how do we get transparency? It's been evident across the country that is difficult, and it can take a lot of time, and a lot of efforts are simply unsuccessful. There are laws that shield disciplinary records. There are laws that shield access to video footage that one might think is pure and objective and would help all sides understand what happened. Oh, sorry, we're gonna try our video again. Let's see if it works. Nope, still nothing, sorry. And there are strong unions that fight to keep records from becoming public. And of course, there are political considerations that often seem to pit the concepts of law and order and transparency and public scrutiny as being in opposition to each other, when frankly, they simply don't need to be. But despite all these difficulties in achieving reform, recent years, and maybe more to the point, really recent events, have demonstrated that reform is possible. And right now, more than ever, I think, there is an increased energy around achieving greater transparency into how we're policed. So today we're going to talk with some people who have been engaged in successful reform efforts in 3 states, California, Colorado, and New York. We'll talk about some of the nuts and bolts of actually getting reforms passed. No small feat there. And we'll also talk a bit about what comes after reform, because like so many things in life, achieving that goal is sometimes not enough. There's more fight that comes afterward. And thankfully, we've got some examples here today that will touch on some very recent developments in transparency, and a couple that have been around for a bit longer. And I hopefully we'll get a little bit of a sense of the sorts of things that we all ought to be watching out for, even when we are successful. I'm going to introduce our panelists now. The Honorable Leslie Herod represents Colorado's 8th District. Elected in 2016 as the first LGBTQ African-American in the Colorado General Assembly, Representative Herod's legislative achievements include the passage of 68 bills addressing topics such as criminal justice reform, mental health, addiction, youth homelessness, and civil rights protections. Among her many successes is the passage this past summer of a comprehensive police accountability bill called the Law Enforcement Integrity and Accountability Act. And this one, I want to highlight it up front, has an interesting component in it of qualified immunity that I hope we can spend some time talking about. Nikki Moore serves as committee counsel for the Public Safety Committee for the California State Assembly. Before her role in the assumption of the role in the legislature, Nikki served as legal counsel and legislative advocate for the California News Publishers Association, where she was part of the successful effort in 2018 to advocate for landmark legislation that opened up access to a wide variety of police personnel and investigatory records. And Molly Griffard is an Equal Justice Works Fellow at the Legal Aid Society's COP Accountability Project, where she works on strategic litigation and policy reforms aimed at ending police abuse. She was involved in lobbying for and drafting the repeal of New York's notorious civil rights law 50A, which many of you may know shielded all manner of police personnel records for most of the last 30 years. I'd like to kick off our discussion, and I do apologize that the video continues to not work, so we'll just continue on. But I'd like to start off the discussion by asking each of our panelists to talk a little bit about what the specific reform issue or transparency issue was around policing that was dealt with in your state, and how the new law has addressed those transparency concerns. Representative Herod, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off on this, I'd love to hear about Colorado's efforts. It's particularly topical, and I hope you can give us a little bit of background on what the issues were and how the new law addresses them.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. I am State Representative Usley here. I do represent Denver, and I also am the chief sponsor of Senate Bill 217, the Law Enforcement Accountability Act. So here in Colorado, as similar to every major city across the country, even the world, we are grappling with the kind of parallel pandemics of racism and COVID. COVID actually shut down our General Assembly right in March. And we came back, though, in the summer, right in May, right after the murder of George Floyd, and the week that the protests started. So that created a unique opportunity, because had things gone their traditional route, we would have been done the first week of May and likely would not have introduced Senate Bill 217. I say that because some portions of 217 were in a bill that I had drafted previously that didn't get support to be introduced by my colleagues. But with the protests and the calls for justice, not only for George Floyd, but for people right here in Colorado who were died or abused at the hands of law enforcement, my Democratic colleagues in the House chose to link arms with the Senate to introduce Senate Bill 217. We started with a Democratic bill, but by the end, we had the support of a lot of Republican members. In fact, only had 2 no votes in the Senate total. So what does Senate Bill 217 do? Specifically, Senate Bill 217's mandates the use of body cameras by all officers by 2023. Now, granted, we are living in a COVID time. We did not allocate additional resources for this provision. We do expect law enforcement to retool their budgets to ensure that they have body-worn cameras. There are many jurisdictions that already have body-worn cameras, but not all. This bill makes it a mandate by 2023. But additionally, with the mandate of body cameras is the release of that body camera footage. So we have a requirement that body camera footage must be released to the family or the victim within 21 days or 45 days in the instance of an investigation. So no longer can the body camera footage be held or edited and held from public view. Additionally, requiring a lot of reporting on policing. Of course, this includes racial profiling data, which we got a lot of pushback for, but it does also include use of force, the stops of civilians and searches, includes forced entry into homes, and every time an officer unholsters their weapon and points it at someone for intimidation purposes. Now, this is even if that action does not end in a ticket or arrest, because we want to know when this is happening so that we can, stop any instances of abuse or profiling. We're also reining in the use of deadly force by officers by changing our use of force standards. Chokeholds and carotid holds are now banned across Colorado. The fleeing felon defense is banned across Colorado. And you must first use lower means of force, non-lethal means of force, when dealing with someone who is suspected of a low-level offense. We're also preventing the rehiring of bad officers. So officers who are found untruthful, who are terminated for cause or decertified, and who have excessive use of force on their records will not only be fired from their departments, but they will be decertified from our post-certification, peace officer standards and training, meaning they will not be able to be a peace officer in any place across the state of Colorado. This is important because we know that officers leave to just go join another agency, and there's no reason why someone should be protected from an officer in Denver only to have them move to Grand Junction and be problematic in their communities. So this bans that and also creates a database, a publicly searchable database that anyone can access, even in other states, to ensure that they are not hiring bad officers from Colorado. We also are increasing the civil rights enforcement by individuals. This is something that everyone has probably heard a lot about. Colorado is the first state to end qualified immunity for law enforcement officers at the local level by statute. So we no longer have qualified immunity. Additionally, officers will be held personally liable when they act in bad faith of up to $25,000 for an instance, or 5% of the entire settlement. And then finally, we added pattern and practice investigation ability for the Attorney General so that he or she can go in to agencies and look at their pattern and practice and sue them, quite frankly, if they have pattern and practice violations, civil rights violations, violations based on race, and if they don't change, I believe in the statute we now have 6 months to change their policies and practice, they will be sued. This provision has already been used in Colorado within the first days of enactment. The Attorney General brought a pattern and practice investigation against Aurora PD. You might know Aurora Police Department from the Elijah McClain case, but also its response to the protesters and violating people's right to protest and actually to peacefully gather during a violin celebration of life for Elijah McClain, as well as the harassment of a young family, including young children under the age of, I believe, 7 and 6, young girls in princess costumes who were thrown on the ground, asked to lay on hot cement, 90-degree day, because they said that the car was suspected of being stolen. Come to find out, the car that the family was in an SUV, and the car that they were looking for was a motorcycle. So we have already put good use, Senate Bill 217. Some of the provisions do not go into place, like the body camera footage, until 2023, but many are already in place and have been since June, when the bill was signed into law on Juneteenth. And we have more work to do, so I'm very much looking forward to the conversation here today. Maybe I'll get some ideas to bring back to my General Assembly. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you very much for that description of the bill. It's really remarkable how much you've got on the police accountability aspect here, but it's also tying into the transparency piece. The qualified immunity removal is something that is beginning to get a bit more traction, I think, around the country in some of these reform efforts. But not surprisingly, it's very difficult to get past some of the union efforts. I'm looking forward to hearing about that when we come to the nuts and bolts piece of this. Molly?
Absolutely. And if you don't mind, I want to add one thing that's come up recently. I won't say I had the foresight of knowing that intending to do this, but there's been a lot of issues with grand jury investigations and with what happened with Breonna Taylor and a grand jury not moving forward with the indictment of those officers for her death, for her murder. We in Colorado, we actually put in 217 a requirement that we actually that the grand jury actually creates and generates a report and explains why. This is not happening across the country, and a lot of times we don't even know what a grand jury does, what they're considering, what they're thinking about, and why they came up with their determination. So in Colorado, we are also bringing transparency to grand juries. I think that will be really fascinating and interesting as we think about how we can reform processes moving forward.
I couldn't agree more. And it's grand juries are sort of from the legal perspective always something of a mystery. I guess that's partially the design, but it does create, especially at a time when we are particularly sensitive to the systemic problems in the application of justice. It adds a really important aspect. I'm glad you brought that up. And let's definitely come back to that. Molly, would you mind filling us in on the efforts in New York and 50A?
Sure. Thank you so much, Diego. And I also just wanted to thank Representative Herod for sharing a really impressive set of reforms, and it gives me hope working on police reforms in New York City and state. But over the summer, we were able, as you mentioned, Diego, to finally repeal Police Secrecy Law 50A, which was one of the worst laws in the country for shielding police records from public disclosure. And some of the consequences of Police Secrecy Law 50A were that it actually kept the public as well as policymakers from being able to access the disciplinary records of police officers. And that would go so far as to victims of police violence, the family members of people who were killed by the police. And I'm a legal fellow at the Legal Aid Society, working in our criminal defense practice. It went so far as to make it nearly impossible to get records, even in criminal cases, where it could be incredibly relevant if the officer had a prior record of, say, lying on the stand or falsifying records. It was very hard for us to get those records, even as defense attorneys. And so it was just, it can't state enough how bad this law was, and that it took many, many, many years of hard work and coalition building to finally get to the point of being able to repeal it. And so the years of coalition building, I think, were critical of really building momentum behind the repeal, educating the public on why this was such an issue. And I think key to that was a coalition called Communities United for Police Reform that brought together legal groups like the Legal Aid Society, as well as grassroots movement groups, groups like the New York Civil Liberties Union, so also on the legal side, but really bringing together a combination of experiences and perspectives to really build this coalition. Oh, looks like video might be available. Oh, hello. All right, so in building this coalition, we were able to lay or I shouldn't say we, I've, recently joined Legal Aid this year, but folks who, came before me and who have been working on this for a very long time, laid the groundwork so that when there was this movement moment, the uprisings in response to the police killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and in that, was what started these protests in May and June. But I think it's important to say too that this is a tipping point of decades of protests and movement building. And so just can't say enough how much this is all sort of building together to be at the right time. But that repealing 50A became the rallying cry because of some of this groundwork that was done to sort of get people behind it. And then it became the clear reform that the legislature and the governor had to deliver on. And they sort of knew that this was, it was being chanted in the streets. I never thought that a police transparency bill would be, the rallying cry, but it became that. And so, it just would not have been possible without this coalition work. And I know as a lawyer and policy wonk, sometimes we think it all comes down to, the negotiating the language and the lobbying in the room. But, so much of it was a combination of that work along with the grassroots movement work.
And I'll chime in because 50A has been one of the things I've been working on since I started at Hearst. Hearst has been engaged with this issue since at least the 80s, and certainly much more aggressively in the last 10 to 15 years, as the law has been was interpreted to apply more and more broadly. But one of the first cases I worked on at Hearst was a records for a police officer who'd been involved in a hit and run incident and was not entirely clear whether he was on or off duty, and just getting reports became a near impossibility. Well, ultimately it was an impossibility. And that's with a law that had a long track record and a legislative history, which I think will be important to our discussion later, a legislative history that was pretty clear in narrowing the scope of what the law was intended to apply to. Nevertheless, time happens and legal decisions get built on each other, and it can become very hard to undo all of that damaging work. Nikki, why don't you fill us in on California, which is an interesting one too, because California's reforms actually predate, they certainly don't predate the problems that we have with police transparency, but they predate the current atmosphere that I think was really fundamental to the passage of reform in New York and Colorado.
Sure. So thanks for having us. And just to give a caveat, I was an advocate at the time that I worked on bills in 2018. Now I'm in committee counsel, so I'm in a little bit of a different role, and I might speak prospectively a little differently than I'll speak about the work I did as an advocate. And I was a newspaper reporter in 2006 when Copley, this case in California, was decided that really shut down any access that we did have based on 40 years of, or actually it's 40 years once we changed the law, but in the 70s, when Governor Brown was governor for the first time, he signed the confidentiality laws that we've been dealing with that slowly were used to ratchet down public access more and more until you got to 2006, when the Supreme Court in the state said basically no more access. And that coinciding with the Black Lives Matter movements, and then specifically Stephon Clark's killing in Sacramento, where in 2018, really weeks before the language that we had been working on was published, all of that was fomenting and leading to what happened in 2018 with Governor Brown in his last year as governor, having served 16 years as governor. It was a really fascinating time where we were working to what could we do, and multiple efforts had failed. This effort was proposed as a modest reform to the legislature. It got out of the assembly with 41 votes, which, basically the minimum amount of votes, at about 10 o'clock on the last day of session and the last year of Brown's governorship. And it really was before all of this new re-energization of energy on police accountability happened this year. And in fact, California didn't have very many accountability measures this year that we looked at, though, except after George Floyd's death, there was an attempt to broaden what we did in 2018, which was establish disclosure rules for police disciplinary records in basically 3 categories: where there's a use of force or a death, where there is a sustained finding of sexual assault of a member of the public, or where there is a sustained finding of dishonesty. And I can talk more about the implementation of the law in a little bit, but even in this year, when there were attempts to expand these categories, sustained is somewhere that the lawmakers are really politically uncomfortable going. So, this idea of disclosure anytime a weapon is pulled and no ticket is issued from Colorado is a really interesting one, because that goes to a much lower level of behavior that's still being scrutinized. And what's happening in California is we have a pretty high standard still to get to those police disciplinary records. And at the same time, we also amended the public records law in 2018 to mandate disclosure of body camera footage quickly. So even when, but that's only in a situation where there's a use of force or a death, serious use of force. So we worked at it from both angles as really just these are public records and investigatory records generally. We have a problem getting in California. It's not like Florida. And so all of that, plus then an attempt this year that ultimately failed within the last hour of the legislature to expand categories, to create fines, daily fines, and also double attorney's fees for litigating police records issues. That was part of the bill. And that was really attempted to address redactions over redactions. And also, you know, when we passed this law and it started to be implemented, over 100 lawsuits were filed, or 100 agencies at least were objecting to disclosure. So a flurry of litigation occurred and attempts to stymie this access, to narrowly interpret the law, to say that it's a retroactive law that's unconstitutional, even though records really means the past and not the future. So there were a lot of barriers that agencies have been putting up to get access. This bill was attempted to get at that, and it ultimately did fail. But if you look at what happened in the California legislature in the last night of session this year, after the crazy pandemic sort of year, it's understandable why that would happen.
And there are also fires to deal with in California that complicate a lot of state resource issues as well.
Absolutely.
You mentioned Florida, which is those of us who spend a lot of time thinking about these issues across multiple states are I think always looking at Florida as an example of tremendous transparency. I will add that I have some colleagues down there who've sounded the alarm that there are some instances of police agencies using a law that's intended to protect shooting victims to apply to situations where officers are involved in a shooting where gunfire is directed at them. It's an interesting quirk in the law that unfortunately is going to require litigation before it gets resolved or maybe a legislative fix. Nikki, you alluded to some of this, and actually Molly and Leslie did as well, but let's talk a little bit about the process of building these coalitions. 50A, I know very well, it's a long-running problem, a specific law that was on the books. California's law sounds like it was similar. Colorado's law sounds like Colorado's reforms are based on sort of really institutional issues, right? And understanding a way to move past those. Well, let's come to that last, because I think that's actually really particularly interesting, and to hear it from the inside the legislature, I think is particularly interesting. But let's talk a little bit about the areas where I think there's probably a fair amount of overlap, and that's how we go about building the coalitions to achieve reform. For my part, I was involved in litigations on behalf of a particular client or set of clients that were seeking access to records, and that is part of how you go about trying to chip away at the law. Of course, sometimes that comes with the negative result of putting cases in front of a court that can have an outsized influence on enhancing restrictions on access to information. In New York, this matter got up to the Court of Appeals, the highest court in New York, several times, and unfortunately, there was rarely much clarity that came out of those cases. If anything, there was an increased sense that police agencies could use 50A to protect more and more from ever being disclosed. But let's turn a little bit to how we go about doing those fights. How do we put together the groups? What's the role that we can all play? I can participate as a litigator on behalf of clients seeking access. I can also participate as a member of the bar and related associations and committees that are interested in pushing for these issues. But that's one small piece. There's a lot more to it. So Molly, why don't you talk a little bit about how 50A came together, and Nikki, if you could chime in as well, and then let's come to Representative Herod about the actual nuts and bolts of how it works inside the legislature.
Sure. I think a critical piece of the coalition building in New York State was really the work of Communities United for Police Reform, which, as I mentioned before, sort of unites grassroots movement groups and, big legal groups like the New York Civil Liberties Union, and, Legal Aid is a very large legal services and defense provider. And there are many other groups that are part of it, but by sort of combining those groups and getting everyone on the same page and pointed in the same direction, I think that's really key. And I think another really key part here is the grassroots movement groups, like the Justice Committee in New York State, which represents the families of people directly impacted by police violence. And so a key part of building public support for the repeal of 50A was hearing the real stories of people who tried to get the records of police officers who were involved in killing their children. There are mothers of of people who were killed by the police who weren't even able to get names of officers involved. We were eventually able to get records related to the police killing of Eric Garner only because of a leak from our Civilian Complaint Review Board. So someone had to risk their job to get that information to the public. And that was the only way the public knew that the officer who killed Eric Garner had, I believe, 17 complaints, or a huge number of complaints for escalating violence, and that he was still walking around in the streets. And so stories like that were critical for building a coalition, humanizing the issue. I apologize, I live on a noisy street. You might be able to hear background noise, but so I think the piece of the coalition building is really getting beyond the typical lawyers and policy wonks who think about, the getting, and I think, there's an important role for that too. And certainly when we were thinking through the nuts and bolts of how you repeal 50A, and then all of these, the compromise language that was being floated to us, and the police unions wanted certain things. There's a role to play for the legal analysis and policy wonks, but how we won public support and how this became the rallying cry was because of the human stories and the directly impacted folks really being out front on the issue.
Well, to add what Molly just said, I think that was essential for us in California as well to be successful, in that we needed stories. And what had been happening in California since 2006 was the newspapers in the state were reporting on the frustrations with getting access to names. I mean, that was litigated in the Supreme Court in 2012, I think, in Long Beach, California. So we had a long record. We had a long record of attempts at small reforms dying in the legislature. And so those stories were essential in getting the public and the elected officials to truly appreciate the problem. And then the natural coalition really had always been in California, the newspapers and the ACLU on these issues. And as Black Lives Matter and the public engagement around these issues grew, then the community grassroots organizations really joined with those sort of more institutional voices like the ACLU, like the Newspaper Association, to amplify it so much more and make it so much more impactful. Hearing the families speak at hearings is incredibly moving. And that was how you had to fight 40 plus years of moneyed interests pushing everyone in the other direction. And at the crux of it, I think too, is not playing into the fear that a lot of this rhetoric is meant to engender. And so if you're really getting at the crux of those things, showing the stories about how bad it was on the other side was really powerful.
Yeah, that actually gets to one of the questions we're getting from the audience that I wanted to pose to Representative Herod. The question comes in from Chris. Many, particularly in Texas, where I live, would argue that many aspects of Colorado's new law is anti-police. How do you frame the conversation that these provisions are pro-public and not anti-police? I think that is where a lot of these things end up dying. There are political considerations that are complicated, and that the people who are actually on the decision-making side of this have to deal with in a way that we as advocates don't. So if you would talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I'm glad the question was asked, because I've been thinking about this a lot too. it's really fascinating because in Colorado, when we introduced and passed the bill, we had no opposition from the law enforcement lobby. They were at the table negotiating the entire time. And by the end of the day, the Fraternal Order of Police, the DAs, the sheriffs, and the chiefs were in support or neutral on the bill. And CCI, the counties, and the cities. I know, Nikki, it's crazy.
I think
but-
everybody's jaw just dropped on that.
I know, and it's so fascinating to hear where the rhetoric has gone since then, because people have made it completely divisive. And I think most folks think it was divisive in the building. Now, it wasn't easy. You know, we spent hours upon hours upon hours at the negotiation table over every single provision, you know, that's real. But at the end of the day, folks were neutral or supportive of the bill. The only opposition were the couple of no votes that we received. So I don't know why we've gotten here, but I do know that it's our job as, you know, folks in leadership, folks who are trying to work on these bills, folks who are trying to have these conversations, to reframe the conversation and put it back on the side of justice. Because this is not a black-white issue. This is not a progressive, conservative issue. In fact, the qualified immunity piece came to me from guess who? Cato. So that's the Koch brothers, okay? They wanted to end qualified immunity for all folks, state and local levels, right? And we said, well, let's talk about this in the context of policing. So this is a Democratic and a conservative bill, and we have to talk about it as such. The one place I should say we did get opposition from, and this was a new group, which was the moms of, or the wives of law enforcement officers. They're a new group. They came out in the last couple of days, and they were very oppositional. But that was really hard to then have them come in and encounter the real life stories of people who were harmed at the hands of law enforcement. And I gotta be honest with you, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, they got it, you know? They watch these videos too, and they say, this is not right. We need to change the law, including a former sheriff of a conservative rural county, Weld County, who is now a senator, who sat at the negotiation table so we could get it right. He was there too. He supported the bill and voted yes at the end. That blew my mind too. I had no idea that we were going to have so much bipartisan support. But the thing that's missing from the conversation, and the thing that pops its head up every once and again, but we really need to have more of, is hearing from law enforcement officers who are saying that this is the right way forward as well. The piece I forgot to mention, I'm sorry about this, there's a lot in the bill, is the duty to intervene piece. In Colorado, in 217, we now require a duty to intervene for law enforcement officers. So if they see another officer with their knee on someone's neck for over 8 minutes, that they have to intervene. And then they also have to report. If not, they have a misdemeanor offense at the lowest, but they could be charged with the highest level offense as the officer who committed the crime directly, and the civil liability, which is hugely important. So the law enforcement officers brought that provision to us. The sheriff said, and the chief said that they needed that, they wanted that provision. And so that was something that was actually initiated by them and supported by them. So, you know, this rhetoric that we're in right now, it's not factual. But we do need more law enforcement officers at the table for the conversation, and ones who are not status quo. I think as the vice chair of judiciary, I do have a certain way of negotiating. It's either you're at the table in good faith to negotiate, or if you want the status quo, you can sit outside of the room and have your opposition when we are in committee. You know, it's different, but it's how I move forward. But I should also add, you know, my father was law enforcement for 30 years. So I know firsthand what it's like. He actually started out as a groundskeeper at Supermax Prison in Florence, Colorado. You know, one of the most highest security penitentiaries in the country, with people who you would argue don't have a reason to live. A lot of folks not charged with anything and never knowing when they're going to get out, and maybe won't ever. He's been in multiple riots, and has never had to point a weapon at anyone in his life, because he believes there's another way forward. And so we need more voices like my dad, who speaks through me, who's one of the best men I know on the planet, to step up and say, we need reform because everyone in our community deserves to be safe and to be protected. And no one's death should be excused because of who they are, right? Or who murdered them, which in this case, we're talking here specifically law enforcement. But I gotta tell you, the transparency piece is so important. This is something that my dad talks about so long, because from a groundskeeper to 30 years later, he was the head of internal investigations by the time he retired. That was his job. And looking at these reports and having transparency in these reports is hugely important. In Colorado, we tried, and our bill was so narrow, it has such little effect. So we have to do more, and I'll be reaching out to you guys to figure out how we can tighten our laws here in Colorado and ensure that we are seeing those records.
Is that, so one of the questions that came in referred to HB 19-1119. Is that the provision you're talking about?
Yeah, highly contested too. And the bill is so narrow, but that's because, this lobby for so long has been able to just say, we'll figure it out ourselves. We'll police the police, don't worry about us. We don't need legislation. So much so that a doctor, a teacher, and a trash man is more regulated and has more responsibility for doing something harmful in their community than a law enforcement officer does. It's insane, right?
Yeah.
We've got to push back against that lobby, and we have to bring people to the table who are willing to negotiate and who are willing to say that some change is needed. We might not agree on every provision, but hopefully we can get it right and move something forward.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more on all of that, and in particular on the need to involve, for a successful effort, to involve police officers, because that comes into play in the later stage, which is actually getting this to work. Before we turn to that, I want to pose another question that's come in from that last HB 19 question came in from Jeff. I want to add another question here from Megan. Some law enforcement agencies say they are open to disclosing more data on certain things, but only to academics and other analysts. What do the panelists think of such carve-outs? And I have my own views on this. I imagine you all do too. But I think it speaks to the question. It speaks to the kind of transparency that we're talking about. Are we talking about transparency into the actions of police generally? Are we talking about transparency into the actions of specific officers? Do we need to carve out different things? Should we have proactive disclosure on a variety of matters, and then bills that are less narrow than the one we were just talking about that focus on specific officers' conduct? What do you all think about that? I'll throw that out to the group.
Well, I don't know why certain people should have access to the documents and not others. It's like, it doesn't really make a lot of sense, and it begs the question, what are you hiding from the public view? I remind folks that law enforcement they're public positions. They are public positions. They are paid for by our tax dollars, and they are public positions, and the information should be made public. Now, I'm not saying give me the address of every domestic violence victim, right? I'm not saying put that out there in a database that's publicly consumable. But what I am saying is we need to be able to track trends on stops. We need to know what intersections you're at. We need to know why. We need to know their race. Those are things that as a community we need, not just academics who then have to, the information is shielded to public view. And as elected officials, we need this information too. That's how we create good policy. And guess what? Maybe it exonerates. People forget that body camera footage exonerates more officers than it convicts.
That's something I wanted to make sure we talked about too. And it's one of the arguments that we're frequently making as legal advocates in favor of the release of this material, because it it opens up more eyes. It provides something that at least, we can all view it, and maybe we come to different conclusions from it. But having the video, if it exists, is an enormously useful tool in trying to understand the arguments that are made in favor or against disciplining a particular officer. Molly and Nikki, why don't you jump in on this as well? Tell me what you're thinking about proactive access, limited access, aggregated data, things like that.
I think it's critical. I mean, to just go back to the question of why not just academics or other analysts, I think, it is just so critical that the public have access for the same reason that, the public, as you're talking about body worn camera footage, that, in New York, we have this sort of horrible situation where the police control what gets disclosed and what doesn't. And so they get to disclose it if it exonerates them, but they don't disclose it to the public if it implicates them. And so I think with every bit of data, that it should be open to the public and not run through a filter, and not that the public has a right to know. And I think that's the great thing about, freedom of information laws, is that it's this bedrock principle of that we live in a democracy. These are public servants, whether it be, police officers or other public employees. And the things that they're up to are something that the public has a right to understand what government is up to. And it simply wouldn't, I think we should not accept compromises of just handing over this kind of information to academics and analysts. The public, and then they get to police what academics and what, political slants that people have. So I think that would really be a dangerous compromise.
I hear you, and I'll throw out there that one of the issues that we've talked about in the circles that I tend to talk about these issues with is this notion of proactive disclosure, which is sometimes a useful way to get around to get the public the kind of information that it needs in order to oversee, I should say, the police in general, right? Because not every instance of police action is something that necessarily requires a scrutiny of that particular officer and this particular incident. It may be that it relates to the patterns. Parad was talking about this before. Understanding that the patterns in order to make better policy. Sometimes that's what you need. It's the statistical information, the demographic information that the Colorado bill will require, that may be particularly useful in understanding how things are policed, and may help to shape grand juries. It may help to shape the way that warrants are issued, things like that. But if we don't know, it's significantly harder. And if we can't know because of individual privacy concerns, which people have different views on, at minimum, it seems we ought to be getting some degree of information automatically, and then we can have our fights about a specific individual's records. Nikki, where do you stand on this?
Well, I definitely agree with everything everyone has said. And I think to add to what you just said, the proactive disclosure element in some ways takes away the visceral union argument that you are attacking one officer versus another. Similar to regular investigatory records being disclosed in Florida. It's not about shaming one person who is involved with the policing system. It's about providing transparency and an honest glimpse at what is going on a comprehensive level.
One question that just came in, it's kind of an interesting one, and it's one that I've handled from a number of my clients. This comes from Susan. At one time, anyone with a scanner could listen in on police transmissions. Today, we're seeing those transmissions encrypted, which means we don't know what police are doing until after the fact, if ever. Is there any way to push back against this? And I'll start it off, and then I invite all of you to jump in on this. But when I was working as a reporter overnights at the AP in New York, the photographers would sit by the scanner, and that's how they would know where they needed to be. And it was a crucial part of the daily news gathering process. And my current life, I am frequently getting questions just like this one. What can we do? They're moving to a special kind of scanner that the general public can no longer access because you need to have the encryption key. Is that an area where you think we ought to have more transparency too? The policing in the moment. Are we living in a time where that's less essential than it might have been in the past because of the fact that everybody, in a sense, can serve as an observer on the scene? What do you all think about that?
Well, as from the experience in California, we've definitely had more and more encrypted scanners. When I was representing the newspapers, that was definitely one of the biggest complaints. And it actually raises the issue of the last question, it's if you're going to say that the general public, it's somewhat dangerous for everyone including an ongoing criminal act for them to then be able to hear the scanner. Then it becomes, how do you draw the line of who should get access and who should not? And so that's something like that is going to be very hard to legislate. But I think the point that you make too is, especially when we've seen all of the protests that have happened, and I've had helicopters circling the cities and live streams going and people wanting to understand what's happening, on balance, is it more important that the public is able to hear that and everyone is able to have some degree of access, or not? Or should that truly be secret? And the past and reporting has showed us that scanners are important tools for giving the public important information. And they've also shown us that in some ways that can cause harm by early reporting that doesn't have truth behind it. So those are the kinds of things that a policymaker is going to look at and say, I have to tip one way or the other. Am I tipping in favor of protecting the public or not? And there are cases that both sides are going to make on something like that. And so it's a complicated and really pressing, like, current issue.
Yeah. And I am going to have a hard stop. So I just want to throw in there that I agree that this is a huge issue, and I have committed to bringing a bill to the Colorado General Assembly to address this. As was stated before, it is a hard and complicated issue, but that doesn't mean that legislators shouldn't work on it. Whoever said that we should only tackle the easy issues, I don't think that's why people elected us. So this is one that literally has proliferated throughout the state of Colorado in the past 10 years, right? I mean, it was used a little, and then a little bit more, and then a little bit more, and then it's everywhere. But I gotta tell you, we've had bills in the past that have died around this issue, but we have changed the conversation and the makeup of the Colorado General Assembly, where I believe we have a lot more of an opportunity to get this bill passed. Additionally, we need journalists, so whoever's on who is a journalist, and we need you all at the Freedom of Information Coalition to come together and support the bill. Now, that is odd for journalists to advocate, right? But this is what happens when a sector doesn't feel like they can advocate for even their own sector within the General Assembly or within policymaking. It's hugely important. And we can crack this nut. We just need to have the right stakeholders at the table. And I believe with journalists at the table with law enforcement, we can figure out what the carve-outs need to be, how they can be narrow, but also how we can have access to those police scanners are so important. And we've got some really interesting, and I love these folks, allies in rural Colorado, some might call them hobbyists, who do, have spent years listening in to police scanners, and now they can't, and that kind of makes it a urban and rural issue now, right? So you're building this coalition that you can get something passed, and I look forward to working with them on it.
Who would have thought that would be the lobby, the hobbyist lobby would be the one that we needed. Representative Herod, before you go, I appreciate you have a hard stop. I do want to just have you speak, if you would, for a couple of minutes about the difficulty after reform is implemented. So you mentioned at the outset the funding issues related to the body cameras and sort of turning it on its head and making it a mandate. So how are you anticipating the next couple of years are going to go as you build up to this really interesting and interesting improvement in the law?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the negative and divisive rhetoric just has to change. We've got to fight against that. It's a part of our jobs now, right? If we're working on this issue, to change the rhetoric. And it's hard. It's hard. Sometimes we slip up, but it is something that we need to do. The other piece is that we have to have some type of statewide investigation unit. But then I think we have to completely reimagine who's policing the police. Why is it that the police or the DAs have the final say? This has got to change because all too often they're too intertwined. So we have to address that issue. And then additionally, to my friends in Texas and other places who are looking at these bills, and people are saying, well, it's just going to cause police to just leave. Well, the bad officers should leave. But the rhetoric in Colorado and what we're hearing about officers just walking off is not true. It's just not true. We've had less than 200 officers retire, be fired, or leave from since the implementation of 217. We have 17,000 officers in Colorado. That's less than our teachers who have left. That's a lower retention rate than our doctors and our medical professionals. Any group who had that low of a retention rate would be cheered, you know? So this whole idea that that we're causing officers to just walk off is just not true. We've got to fight that too, and we've got to fight it with truth. So I think at the end of the day, we need legislators and leaders who have courage, who will stand up, who will provide the actual real truth behind why these bills are important, who will reach across the aisle to make these bills pass, and who are willing to have good faith negotiations. But essential in all of this is having the community out there supporting it. One of my colleagues said she had 38,000 emails on this bill. She was not a Denver colleague. It's so important that we have people out there supporting it, and it's important that we have accurate information getting out to people and constituents who are fighting for change every single day. So thanks again so much for having me. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to further conversations and partnership on the encryption issue. So
I really appreciate you joining us. We've hit the hour mark, and in deference to Representative Herrod's hard stop, I'm gonna suggest that we can call it a day here. I'd like to thank thank the panelists. This was really an engaging and interesting conversation, and one that I suspect we're going to be talking about for many years to come. I congratulate you, Representative Herrod, on the success in Colorado. That's that's a real model for the rest of the country. Molly, the fantastic work on 50A. I mean, there's more to be done. I've got a case I'm working on right now that is right in the middle of it. I know you are too. And Nikki in California, now you're on the other side of the equation, so hopefully you'll be pushing for increased transparency. But thank you all for joining on behalf of NFOIC. Thanks for participating in the conference, and have a great day. Thank you.